And joining us now here in studio, Tony Keller, author of the Mowat Centre report, The New Economics of the NHL, and of course a contributing Your Agenda Insight essayist. Hi, Tony.
Good to see you.
Shame this study didn't get any attention.
Yeah, no one really seems to care very much about hockey.
Yeah, that's not quite true. Tony, how many teams we got in Canada right now in the NHL?
We have 6 NHL teams in Canada, and our report looked at this and said, how many more could Canada support? That was the big question we wanted to answer. You've got struggling teams in the United States, some teams that are on the brink of failing, some teams that are being propped up by the NHL, and you've got Canadian markets that seem to be desperate for a team. So we just crunched the numbers.
But most people, when they have this conversation, say, yeah, we could do one team here, maybe another team there. You said 6.
Yeah.
How'd you come up with 6?
Yeah. So we looked at the factors that influence the success of a team. And as we crunched the numbers, we found there are really 2 big factors that influence the success of an NHL team. One is the population of the market it's located in. That seems pretty logical.
Right.
The other one is the border. You get a very large bonus for being located in Canada compared to the United States, and that's why small Canadian markets like Edmonton are great hockey markets, some of the biggest hockey markets in the NHL. And big cities like Phoenix, you know, a city that's bigger than Vancouver, the size of Montreal, they're terrible hockey markets.
They don't like hockey.
They don't like hockey. That's what it comes down to. You know, a lot of people, not a lot of hockey fans. Edmonton, not so many people, but almost all of them are hockey fans.
I'd like to, you know what, I want to do a survey here in the studio. Let's try this. Michael Smith, our director, did not know I was going to do this, but for the heck of it. He's got the list here of the top 10 ranked in order of viability. Where would you put the first new Canadian hockey team in this market? Kevin, where would you put the first team? What city would take it?
Oh, Kitchener.
Kitchener? That's 4th. What's number 1?
Winnipeg.
Winnipeg is number 7. Tina?
Hamilton.
Hamilton is number 2. Isn't that funny? What did you say?
Toronto.
Yeah.
Toronto.
Yeah. We think the Greater Toronto area, for sure, is the best place to be putting a team. Hamilton's pretty close, by the way. But Southern Ontario, look, here's the fact. Southern Ontario, the Greater Golden Horseshoe, you've got 9 million people. It's probably the biggest hockey market in the world. And there's only one NHL team. And that NHL team has record revenues, way above the league average, TV viewership, way above the league average.
And they want to keep it that way.
And they'd love to keep it that way.
Let's do the list, actually,
Yeah.
since we've got the list.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys eventually got to the right one, which was number 1, yes, a second team in the Greater Toronto area.
Yep.
Number 2 on the list, the Hammer. Number 3, a second Montreal team. Number 4, Kitchener-Waterloo. Number 5, another team in Vancouver. Number 6, didn't see this coming, London, Ontario. Number 7, yes, Winnipeg, we hear so much about. Number 8, Quebec City, the other market we hear so much about. Number 9, don't let the small population fool you, Saskatoon, hotbed for hockey. And number 10, Halifax. Now, a couple of those cities on the list, obviously, we ought to pay attention to because they had teams before and lost them. Winnipeg and Quebec City.
Yeah. And
what's different?
Just to be clear about that list. So the bottom 2 teams, Saskatoon and Halifax, we think those cities are probably too small. We surveyed them, we looked at them, we reviewed them. We think they're probably too small to support a team. The other thing to remember is those 4 cities we named in Southern Ontario, Toronto, Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, London, they can't all 4 simultaneously support a team. But what we're saying is you could support a second team in Toronto for sure, and you could support one other team in Southern Ontario. And you could put that other team in Hamilton or Kitchener-Waterloo or London. And even London, though people think of it as a small city, it's a big market. Anyway, sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No, not at all. Let's focus on Quebec City and Winnipeg, which had teams a decade and a half ago and lost them.
Yeah.
What's changed that you think would enable them to make it?
So a few things have changed. First of all, you got to remember, when those cities lost their teams, we had kind of a perfect storm of bad news for Canada. Canadian economy was going slowly as the U.S. economy in the early 90s, mid-90s was actually recovering really nicely from a recession. Canadian dollar was low and going lower. The NHL had salaries that were exploding. All these things happened simultaneously. There was just no way these teams could survive. Now, you're in a situation, and there was also the pull of the United States, the excitement the NHL had that, you know, we could get into the U.S., we can get into a market like Phoenix, we can someday get a big U.S. national TV contract, and that recedes into the distance further and further year by year. NHL hockey is just not that popular in the U.S. It's a second-tier sport.
We know
2 decades later, we know these markets are now, partly because of the Canadian dollar, way more viable. These markets are also protected by the collective bargaining agreement that the NHL has. It controls salaries to some extent.
There's a
Player
salary
salaries.
cap.
There's a salary cap.
Meaning, Detroit can't outspend Quebec City 3-1, 4-1
Exactly.
anymore.
So salaries can go up, but league revenues have to go up. What was happening in Winnipeg and Quebec City in the early 90s, I'm remembering these numbers off the top of my head, but I think Winnipeg's payroll went from $3-4 million a year to something like $15-20 million a year in like 4 or 5 years. It went up so rapidly. There's no way you
crowds
can
didn't
raise.
get any bigger?
You can't raise ticket prices. Yeah. You can't quintuple your ticket prices overnight. That was the problem that those teams ran into.
Now, interestingly enough, you've got the two cities most rumored about, Quebec City and Winnipeg, are down near the bottom of the list.
Yeah.
Is that to suggest they would be the least viable places to put teams in Canada?
Of the Canadian cities we surveyed, they'd be less viable. Now, I know, looking at the numbers from Phoenix, looking at the numbers from Atlanta, Quebec City and Winnipeg would have higher revenues than those teams. They'd sell more tickets, and most importantly, they'd sell them at higher ticket prices, quite a bit. So they'd be ahead. But Toronto, Hamilton, second team in Montreal, these are big cities with large corporate concentration, head offices, large population of high-income people. You put it all together, there's just a bigger market in the big cities. It's not that complicated.
Okay, let's look at the Ontario situation, because you've got 4 Ontario cities listed as potential sites. If you were going to put a second team into the Greater Toronto Area, there's only one place it could play right now, which is the Air Canada Centre. And last I heard, I don't think the owners of the Maple Leafs are interested in a second tenant.
Yeah, that's the interesting question is, where's this team going to play?
Right.
But one of the things that happened, you may remember in the mid-90s when the Raptors were coming to Toronto, and the Raptors were going to build their own, they were going to build this thing called the Air Canada Centre. They were going to build their own arena, and the Maple Leafs were going to have a competing arena, and they worked out a deal because both teams came together and they realized we're going to blow our brains out if we try to have 2 competing arenas. So it became logical for both of these teams to come together, to work it out. In the end, the Maple Leafs bought the Raptors, but there are other ways to work it out. In Los Angeles, you've got 2 NBA teams playing in the same arena. In New York City, you've got 2 NFL football teams sharing a stadium. They own it 50-50. So you see lots of examples of this, and it would be, if the NHL were to allow a team, or if the NHL were to be forced to allow a team to come into the Toronto market, the greater Southern Ontario market, it would be very logical for the incumbent team to try to find a way to coexist and share an arena.
We're going to show our age, or I'm going to show my age here. There's actually precedent for this. When the old World Hockey Association existed, the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Toronto Toros both played in Maple Leaf Gardens. So
and there were a few cities where that happened. I believe in Boston and Philadelphia it happened as well. And of course, if you go all the way back to the 1920s and 30s, Montreal Maroons and the Montreal Canadiens shared the Montreal Forum.
Okay.
So the NHL's
That's even before my time.
Me too. The NHL's done this before.
Would there be an advantage if you think about, if you really want to establish your own brand and your own name? It'd probably be logical, though, to put the team somewhere in the 905, like maybe in York Region,
Possibly.
Richmond Hill or something. You could still call it the Toronto something, but it would have its own identity.
The challenge is that arenas are really expensive. An arena, the Quebec City's talking about building a $400 million arena. If the team had to build the arena itself, finance the arena itself, and pay for the arena, earn enough money to pay for the arena, it starts to become a challenge. Now, Canadian teams have been able to do that. Look, the Air Canada Centre doesn't get any public money. The Bell Centre in Montreal doesn't get any public money. The norm in the United States is these arenas get public money. But in Canada, that's not what happens. But in one market like Toronto, I'm not, ideally, if you were the owner of one of these teams, you'd want to find a way to do a deal with the other team if you could.
Left unspoken here is the fact that none of this is possible because the Maple Leafs believe and the Buffalo Sabres believe that they have a veto over any team coming within their so-called territory. Is there a need to get clarification on that before any of this speculation goes forward?
Yes, because we actually have the teams and the league saying different things.
Right.
So the NHL Constitution seems to be pretty clear on this. It seems to say teams have a 50-mile exclusive zone, and no teams are allowed into their zone unless that team pays some kind of indemnity. And that happened in the past when the New York Islanders moved into New York, when the New Jersey Devils moved into that zone, when the Anaheim Mighty Ducks were created, they paid a fee to the Los Angeles Kings.
Millions of dollars to Bruce
Exactly.
McDonald.
So as you say, the Leafs, Buffalo Sabres, and others say, hey, we've got a veto, and we don't want a team in our zone. The league, though, is very careful. The league says no team has a veto. It's a league majority vote. And the reason the league says that is because under Canadian law, it's a problem. If an individual team has a veto, it's reducing competition. If the Toronto Maple Leafs can say, we don't want any competitors in our area. I mean, imagine if, your local restaurant, say, they sold out every night, they're full, reservations for months in advance, and another restaurant wants to come into the neighborhood and they said, no, we're not going to allow it. You'd realize there's a legal problem with that.
That's a neat analogy, but it's not a perfect analogy, you will grant, right? The NHL is different from...
That's right. Well, the NHL, that's right. You'd say the NHL has franchises.
Yes.
NHL's like McDonald's. It's not like the entire restaurant industry. The thing is, the NHL, it's the dominant league. It's the only league. You'd have to start up a competing league to compete with the NHL. So there are provisions in the Competition Act, and the last time the Competition Bureau looked at it, because it did look at it once when Jim Belzili was trying to buy a team and move it here, they said, if a team has a veto, that might be a problem. The Competition Bureau said, it looks like a team doesn't have a veto. We think that ought to be looked at again. There's at least a question to be raised, because it appears that teams have vetoes, and teams like the Leafs insist that they have a veto. They can prevent another NHL team from coming into their very wealthy, very rich market.
Let me pull a quote out of the study here. Here we go. Here's Tony Keller with Neville Maguire. So why does Canada not have more than 6 NHL teams? The answer lies in the fact that the NHL is a monopoly, or more precisely, a cartel, and not a free market. It artificially limits the supply of NHL teams and controls where they play. The league has no interest in having supply meet demand, but rather benefits from ensuring that supply always remains below demand. Artificial scarcity is the number of teams that drives up their value. A team that runs into trouble in one city can be sold to a hopeful owner in another city. In contrast, a failed restaurant in Phoenix is not moved to Winnipeg, it just fails. Okay, I get what you're saying here, but how do you go about changing that?
Yeah. So as I said, that's a question of Canadian law, possibly. It really has to be looked into whether the league, in its current structure, because the league does, it does reduce competition. The league's interest is in making sure that there are a limited number of teams. If you or I or any other entrepreneur could start a team whenever we wanted, or buy a team and move it without the league's permission, there'd be more teams in Canada. There'd be teams in Southern Ontario. There'd be competition with the Leafs. That would immediately happen. So the league wants to have scarcity, because without scarcity, they can't get cities like Glendale to.
I get this, but who makes this happen?
Yeah.
Does some politician have to take this up?
There are two possibilities. One, some politicians have to take a serious look at it, and that's at the federal level. And the other is the Competition Bureau has to take a look at it. And again, as I said, it took a very cursory look at this in 2007. But I think it has to be, first of all, at a political level, it has to be made clear that the Competition Act applies to the NHL. Maybe the Competition Bureau didn't fully get that. And second of all, the Competition Bureau should take a look at it again. And I think some politicians should be seized of this. I mean, why not? It would only benefit Canadians. It would benefit Canadians, Canadian fans in hockey, if we take we put the microscope on the NHL and push the NHL to allow more teams to move to Canada.
Now, funnily enough, not everybody responded with universal praise to your study.
Yeah.
The notion of 6 new NHL teams in Canada did not meet with universal favor. Here's Damien Cox, who's from Hamilton, so he's got to be right. Damien Cox writing in the Toronto Star. Michael, if you would, next board. Basically, this report seems to contemplate an NHL, he writes, in which none of the teams would be permanently tied to any cities. Logistics like leases, schedules, divisional alignments, collective bargaining agreements, salary caps, and TV deals could all be fluid, and any businessman that wanted to ice NHL clubs would simply be able to, quote, create new teams. Maybe there would be 25 teams, or 47. Perhaps the Dallas Stars would play the 2011-12 season in Saskatoon, then shift to Halifax the next year, if free owners could just move existing teams on an urge. Okay, he's clearly making the point that you can't have a completely free market here, and you would agree with that, I presume.
It would be challenging. Well, it could happen, but you could have something somewhere in between, complete league control. But by the way, at the moment, in all the professional leagues, teams do pick up and move. I mean, it's not that the NHL is opposed to teams moving. The NHL is opposed to teams moving out of particular markets that it wants to be in. But hey, if a team's in Winnipeg and it wants to move, go for it. And we've seen in the other leagues lots of team movement, and it's team movement chasing arena subsidies or a new arena. The NBA team in Sacramento is about to move to Los Angeles. We've seen all kinds of stuff like, we'll have 3 NBA teams in Los Angeles. We've seen all kinds of stuff like this happen. So, it's not that the league has to become an absolute free-for-all, but it could certainly be opened up more.
What are the chances of any of this happening?
That's a good question. I'd say, okay, the chances of the Canadian government becoming very interested and seized of this matter, I don't know. That's that's up to politicians in Ottawa.
Current Prime Minister's
the
a big
current
hockey
Prime Minister
fan.
is a huge hockey
Cares
fan.
about this stuff.
Yeah. Chance of the Competition Bureau looking at this again, I think is pretty good because somebody's going to try to bring a team to Southern Ontario at some point. Someone's going to want to. The chance of more teams coming back to Canada without this kind of action, against the NHL, not bad. Winnipeg's on the verge of getting a team. Atlanta is on the verge. Atlanta's on the verge of losing its NHL team. It's been losing money for years. The owners want out. You've got a couple of teams in Florida that are losing money. You've got Columbus Blue Jackets that can't stop losing money. The Nashville Predators can't stop losing money. So
You think maybe one day the league would get the idea that maybe we should go where people actually like this game?
that's right. There starts to be a compelling logic to it, and that compelling logic may begin to drive into the league's brain right about now.
Sounds like a plan. Who do you like in the Stanley Cup final?
I don't know.
You're like me. If it's not the Leafs, I don't care.
That's right.
As long as it's not the Habs. Tony, thanks for this. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.